temperature next.
And I think it's my turn.
Yep.
So off sourcing now and onto temperature, and you can read the benefits of low temperature. And this is an area that we as a company feel is, and I think anybody in the industry would say is the most important part of cut flower longevity. So it just has so many benefits, slows down respiration and all the other things that you can see here. Optimal storage temperatures. For most cut flowers, we're looking for 1 to 3 centigrade, 34 to 37 degrees. And we'll talk about how to manage that here in a second. Exceptions to this is your first reality check. Tropical flowers would be 55 degrees. And if you don't have a tropical cooler, then you're just going to have to put them at room temperature. So those are kind of the two data points there on storing the flowers. How do you check for temperature? So this is how I go about it. I think we found it's really the best way to do it. And I'm a big proponent of, it's fine if you want to have thermometers in your coolers, but I'm a big proponent of checking water temperature. So if you have a bucket that has been in your shop for more than a day, all I did was go to the hardware store and buy a meat thermometer. So by buying a $3 meat thermometer and walking around a cooler, I'm checking 3 different areas here. The first is checking the bucket temperature. So if you think about it, if you're running in and out of a cooler 35 times a day, that air temperature is going to fluctuate and go up and down. So you'll have readings, but they won't necessarily give you the general reading of your cooler temperature. If you have a bucket of water, the mass is so great in it that it can't go up and down in temperature during the day. So it's a really good way to find out exactly what your cooler is kicking out. And the second photo there is just checking the heads of the flowers themselves. So you can put the thermometer on the head of the flower, and if you have some cold spots or some areas where you think you might have problems, where the rubber hits the road is where the air is hitting that flower and what the temperature of the flower is there. So that's a good way to check and see if you have any problem areas in your cooler. The last, and this, I'm sorry about this, but that picture did not come out very well, is to check the box temperature on incoming flowers. So in this example here, if you can't read that, I did a probe check on the flowers that were in this box that arrived and they were 53 degrees. So at this point, you have too hot of flowers in that box. The first thing you should do if you cannot get to process them right away is to get the box open and try and find the room to do that. It is important to realize that cardboard's a great insulator, and if the flowers heat up, they're going to respire more and they're actually going to generate more heat. So if you take this box that comes in and you just throw it in the cooler without checking it, the temperature is probably not going to go down much from what that reads there unless you open it up and get some air circulation in there. So that would be the 3 areas that really is a good way to check your temperature. The other thing is to remember that if you're working with your coolers, to make sure that you tick your temperatures down slowly. So if you walk in after we get done talking here and your coolers are 42 degrees, don't crank it down to 34. You want to start moving them down a degree at a time and make sure that your equipment can handle the loads. We don't sell coolers. You know, we are not experts on compressors and things like that. You can get that advice other places, but start to work your temperatures down and understand that respiration rates, even between 37 and 41 degrees on a flower, is very great. So you can make some huge gains on your flower quality by doing this. Gary, I think that's yours, isn't it?
Yep, I got this one. Okay, so here we have a slide showing data from a temperature recorder that was placed in a box of flowers from the farm in South America to delivery to the retailer. And you'll see a line just above 40 degrees. This is kind of the realistic temperature that we would hope to keep throughout the delivery of these flowers, which is taking, between 5 and 6 days. And what you can see is When the flowers arrive in Miami, we have this huge breakdown in the cold chain. And what's likely happening here is they're sitting out at the tarmac at the airport. They're going through customs. And so this is usually where we see the breakdown. And there's really not a whole lot the growers or the wholesalers can do. Then you see when it arrives at the wholesaler, it's getting pre-cooled again. The temperature is going back down. And then we have it transported by refrigerated truck, hopefully, to the retailer. But we can see that even during transport, the temperatures are rising. So this big spike that we're seeing in temperature, what it's doing is it's really shortening the vase life of these flowers. So this breakdown in the cold chain is going to shorten the vase life and the experience of the consumer. That's ultimately where it's going to be observed. So we're going to discuss in detail why this happens, why it's so important to get your flowers into the cooler quickly and keep them cold, because every minute that they're at room temperature or above these cool temperatures, you're losing vase life on those flowers. And in the next slide, we're going to start to delve into that a little more deeply. Okay, so one thing plants can do that animals can't is make their own food. So when a flower is in the field, it's obtaining water and nutrients from the soil, taking carbon dioxide from the air and energy from the sun to make its own food in the form of sugars. And you may recall from your high school biology class, this process is called photosynthesis, and it occurs in the green leaves and stems that contain a pigment called chlorophyll. And these tissues, these green tissues on the plant, are essentially little food factories in the plant. And once the flower is harvested or cut from the ground, it loses this ability to make its own food. It's taken inside, so it doesn't have high light levels. It doesn't have water and nutrient supplied from the roots, so it can no longer make its own sugars. So unless these sugars are supplemented by a flower food, this flower is depending on whatever food reserves it has left in the leaves and in the stems. And we're going to discuss the importance of this in the next slide. So the next thing we want to talk about is respiration. And this is a process by which all living organisms use oxygen to metabolize sugars or food and produce energy for their cells. This energy is in the form of a molecule called ATP. And ATP is what keeps these cells alive and working. So we're respiring when we're breathing, we're taking in oxygen, and we're breathing out CO2, and we're making energy for our cells. So an analogy I like to use is a runner may eat a high carb diet or a high carb dinner the night before a 5K race to ensure that their body has enough energy to finish the race. And for cut flowers, you know, the marathon stops or starts when they're cut in the field, and then they have to rely on the stored energy reserves that they have to finish the race. And the race is really meeting the vase life expectations of the consumer. So this is why we keep flowers cold. We want to decrease respiration and the use of these energy reserves. And cold temperatures slow this process down, and the flower can conserve its energy and it can live longer. So if we think back to the slide where we had the temperature recorder, you know, that long period out in those high temperatures could be taking days off the final vase life of that flower and days off of the consumer experience. Okay, next slide, please. So in this slide, we have a graph, and on the y-axis, we're actually looking at the respiration rate. This is something we can measure. We can actually take a flower and put it in a closed system, and then we can take an air sample out of that system and measure how much carbon dioxide is produced over time. So when we respire, we take in oxygen and expel carbon dioxide. The flower does the same thing. So we can measure this, and you can see over time, respiration of this rose increases dramatically as the temperature increases. So increasing respiration occurs as the temperature gets higher. Okay, next slide. So this is what you need to remember, and just keep this in your mind. Temperature increases, respiration increases, vase life decreases. And if you have this in your mind, you'll always think about getting those flowers into cold as soon as you can. Don't leave them sitting out waiting to process them, because every minute you leave those flowers out, you're decreasing the quality of those flowers. So just as a rule of thumb, don't leave flowers out at room temperature longer than they need to be. And also remember, as Bruce showed in the first slide on temperature, respiration decreases with temperature, which also decreases the response of ethylene. Bacteria grows at a slower rate at lower temperatures, so there's lots of benefits to keeping flowers cold.